She was 20 and homeless. No bed, no family she could safely call, no dry shoes. Just a borrowed wool coat and $9 she had hidden beneath a loose kitchen tile. And with that $9, she bought a forgotten tortoiseshell comb studio outside Leominster in Worcester County, Massachusetts, abandoned since 1971. The north wall bowed 4 inches outward. Rain passed freely through the cedar-shingled roof. The county condemned it on October 3, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. But inside its mud-caked polishing drum, behind a double lining of leather, unopened for 51 years, waited a compartment holding money, a golden comb, and a letter written for the person desperate enough to stay. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Margot Elise Bell had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she learned to recognize a room by the quickest way out. At school, she chose the desk nearest the door. In restaurants, she noticed fire exits before menus. Even in summer, she kept shoes beside her bed, toes pointed toward the hallway, because her mother's second husband moved through the house after midnight, with the slow, searching steps of a man looking for someone to blame. Her father had died when Margot was 5, leaving behind a dented lunch pail, 2 photographs, and a mother who gradually began mistaking endurance for loyalty. Lorraine Bell worked mornings at a medical laundry and returned each afternoon smelling of steam bleach and the metal rails of the pressing machines. She rarely spoke of Margot's father. Silence became her method of keeping the household upright. The one place Margot never watched the door was the workshop of Sister Beatrice Vale. Sister Beatrice lived at St. Cecilia's home in a brick convent above the Nashua River, where she had entered religious life after 27 years making ornamental combs. She was 81 when Margot met her through a parish meal program, narrow as a folded ruler with silver hair, visible beneath a plain gray veil, and a right thumb permanently flattened from decades of pressing heated horn. Every Saturday, Margot took the number 7 bus, carrying 2 apples and a paper sack of rolls. Sister Beatrice unlocked a shallow cabinet containing 6 files, a bow saw polishing cloths, and scraps of ox horn ambered by age. They worked at a scarred maple table beneath a window, whose glass turned the river green. The old woman taught her to warm horn slowly, between iron plates, never over direct flame. At 160 degrees, it softened without blistering. Margot learned to flatten it, stain it with alkanet dye, and touch the teeth of a twinning saw to the edge so evenly that 2 interlocking combs could be cut from one narrow strip. Afterward, they polished each piece with chalk sawdust and a thumbful of rendered fat. Speed leaves fingerprints that patience must later erase. Sister Beatrice said it whenever Margot forced a blade. The words were not about slowness. They meant that carelessness always sent its bill to someone else. She died during Margot's 17th winter, after pneumonia settled into both lungs. By the time Margot reached the convent, the cabinet had been emptied during renovations. The files went to a scrap dealer, the saw disappeared, and the horn pieces were thrown away as rubbish. A young administrator handed Margot the 2 apples still waiting in Sister Beatrice's drawer. At home, Raymond Pike had begun counting Margot's pay before she did. He never struck her. He did not need to. He stood too close while she opened envelopes, removed bills with 2 fingers, and asked why a girl living under his roof required savings. His voice stayed low, almost patient, which made the house listen harder. When he drank, he placed his empty glass precisely beside her plate and waited for her to fill it. Refusal brought no blow, only a chair dragged across the kitchen and hours of footsteps outside her bedroom. On November 12, 2022, Margot came home from the bakery with $43 folded inside her sock. Raymond was waiting beside the stove. On the table lay her father's lunch pail, its lid bent where he had forced it open. The small roll of emergency money she kept inside was gone. He held out his palm. Margot removed her wet coat, but did not reach for her sock. "Give me your wages or leave before midnight." Exactly 8 words, calmly delivered. Her mother stood at the sink, drying the same white plate again and again. Margot looked at Lorraine's shoulders, waiting for them to turn. They never did. Water slipped from the faucet in patient intervals, while Raymond carried Margot's suitcase to the porch and set it in the rain. She did not take the suitcase. Its broken wheel would have slowed her. She took the wool coat, the lunch pail, and the $9 still hidden beneath the kitchen tile. At the corner, she heard the porch door close. She kept walking toward the bus station without looking back, rain gathering at the cuffs of her sleeves. For 6 weeks, she moved south and east by whatever route required the least money. The first nights were spent in Fitchburg, beneath the concrete stairs of a municipal parking garage, where exhaust settled like dust on her tongue. She paid $3 for soup, then stopped buying meals except on alternate days. In Shirley, she slept behind a laundromat vent, because the bricks remained warm after closing. In Ayer, a church volunteer gave her wool socks and a bus token, but asked too many questions about home. Margot thanked her and left before dawn. Her $9 became $6.20, then $3.85. She learned which convenience stores discarded wrapped sandwiches before midnight, and which police officers woke sleepers with a shoe instead of a voice. At the Leominster bus depot, she spent $1 on coffee and kept the paper cup for water. By Christmas week, she slept in the covered doorway of a shuttered insurance office on Mechanic Street. Snow entered sideways and collected along the lunch pail's rim. Each morning she folded her coat beneath one arm, washed in the public library restroom, and sat among the heating pipes until feeling returned to her fingers. On December 27th, she found the advertisement pinned beneath a notice for piano lessons. County disposal. Abandoned workshop. Structure unsafe. Cash transfer, $9. Buyer assumes all liability. Below, it was a grainy photograph of a narrow building with a collapsing porch and the faded words, Vale Ornamental Comb Works across its gable. Margot read the surname twice. At the reference desk, she asked for old city directories. The librarian, whose glasses hung from a green cord, brought 3 volumes and did not ask why Margot's sleeves were damp. In the 1968 directory, the workshop's proprietor was listed as Agnes Vale Comb Finisher Widow. Sister Beatrice had once mentioned an older cousin named Agnes, who refused to abandon the old methods when factories turned to plastic. Margot counted the money in her pocket. $9 exactly. She copied the county office address onto the back of the advertisement, returned the directories, and filled her paper cup at the fountain. Outside, the afternoon had begun to freeze. Buses hissed along Pearl Street, carrying people toward warm kitchens and rooms with doors that belonged to them. Margot buttoned the borrowed coat to her throat and started walking toward the county clerk's office. For the first time in 6 weeks, she was not searching for somewhere to sleep. She was going to purchase the place that everyone else had already decided to destroy. The morning bus left Leominster before sunrise, carrying Margot north, through streets glazed with frozen rain. She rode 12 miles beneath a heater that coughed more dust than warmth, then walked another after the driver let her off beside a closed farm stand. Her shoes took water through the seams before noon. That evening, she slept in a hay barn outside Lunenburg, curled between square bales, while the temperature fell to 17 degrees. Mice moved softly beneath the boards. Once near midnight, a horse in the adjoining stall exhaled through the wall, and the sound was so steady that she slept for almost 3 hours. By the following afternoon, Leominster appeared again below a low ridge, its church steeples standing above brick mills and winter bare maples. Margot passed Donnelly's Pharmacy, Valenti's Bakery, the Twin City Diner, Rourke Hardware, and a narrow watch repair shop called Minute Hand, all within 3 blocks. Their windows held the ordinary evidence of belonging prescription bottles in white bags, loaves cooling behind glass, handwritten lunch specials, coils of copper wire clocks waiting to be collected. The Worcester County Annex occupied a former savings bank on Church Street. Its granite steps had been salted, though a strip of ice remained along the brass handrail. Inside, the air smelled of radiator heat, and paper kept too long in drawers. A clerk sat behind a waist-high counter under a framed map of tax parcels. She had a pale scar running from the corner of her mouth to her jaw. And when she read, she pressed one finger against it, as though holding a page open. Her nameplate said, MRS Evelyn Hart. Margot placed the advertisement on the counter. Mrs. Hart looked first at the paper, then at Margot's damp coat, then at the lunch pail hanging from her hand. You came about the Vale property. Yes, ma'am. The clerk pulled a gray folder from beneath the counter. It was thick with inspection notices, unpaid tax statements, and photographs taken from angles that made the building appear already half-buried. You understand the well has not been tested. Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no electricity. Yes, ma'am. You understand the roof may not carry snow. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not reimburse you if the structure fails. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Hart held her gaze for a moment longer. Most people stop me after the second warning. Margot did not answer. She removed the folded bills from her coat pocket and smoothed them on the counter. The paper had softened from weeks of being handled. Mrs. Hart counted once, then again. She opened a ledger, turned it sideways, and indicated the signature line with a black fountain pen. Margot signed carefully. The NIB scratched over the paper. The clerk took the deed to a heavy brass press mounted beside the filing cabinet. She inserted the bottom corner, pulled the long handle, and stamped the county seal into the page with a dull mechanical crack. The sound passed through Margot's hands where they rested on the counter. That makes it yours, Mrs. Hart said. The words were quiet. She unfolded a road map and drew a route in blue pencil. Lancaster Street South. Turn east where the old reservoir road forks. You will pass a white Grange Hall, then a stone culvert. The studio is another 3/4 of a mile beyond that, behind 2 walnut trees. Do not use the footbridge. The center boards are rotten. Margot folded the map. Mrs. Hart had begun closing the folder when her finger stopped on the deed. Bell, she said. Margot waited. The clerk reopened the file and drew out a transfer record dated May 14, 1958. One of the witness signatures had faded to brown, but the name remained legible. Beatrice Vale. Mrs. Hart looked from the signature to Margot. You said nothing about knowing the family. I didn't know I did. That was Sister Beatrice, wasn't it? Margot's fingers tightened around the map. You knew her. Everyone over 50 knew of her. She repaired altar combs, hairpins, spectacles, whatever people brought after the factories stopped taking small work. My mother had a mourning comb she cracked during a winter funeral. Sister Vale joined this break so finely you had to breathe on it to find the seam. Mrs. Hart touched the faded signature with one nail. She used to come here with Agnes Vale. They argued over taxes in voices so polite that nobody else could tell they were arguing. Agnes owned the studio. She did. Beatrice worked there before the convent. The two of them were cousins, though they behaved more like sisters. When Agnes closed the trade, Beatrice signed the final inventory. Margot glanced at this deed in her hand. Why didn't she tell me? Mrs. Hart closed the folder gently. People who lose a place do not always know how to speak of it. Sometimes they wait until speaking will no longer change anything. She opened a drawer, removed a narrow brass key on a paper tag, and slid it across the counter. Front door. Though the door may have forgotten. Outside, the sky had lowered to the color of tin. Margot followed Lancaster Street past the last row of houses. Snow lay gray beside the road, pocked by sand and tire spray. At the old reservoir fork, she turned onto a narrower lane where bare branches met above the ditches. A man splitting wood beside a green farmhouse paused with his maul raised. His left boot was wrapped in silver tape. At his feet, a red hound with one white ear lifted its head and gave a single uncertain bark. You headed to the Vale place, the man called. Margot nodded. I won't bite, the man said, though the dog had not moved. Name's Jasper. Mine's Amos Reed. Margot Bell. Amos lowered them all. Stay left at the culvert. Right side floods under the snow. Margot thanked him. He studied the lunch pail, the rolled deed, and the coat too large for her shoulders. Whatever question formed in his face, he kept it. Walnuts mark the entrance, he said. You'll see them. The hound followed Margot to the edge of the yard, then sat in the road and watched her go. The walnut trees stood half a mile farther on black-limbed and enormous, their trunks nearly 4 feet through. Between them, a wagon path descended toward a strip of wetland, where cattails showed above the ice. The studio waited beyond the reeds. It was a timber-framed building, roughly 24 feet wide and 40 feet long, clad in weathered clapboards over a low fieldstone foundation. A cedar roof sagged near the north eave. The brick chimney leaned slightly away from the ridge, its mortar pale and powdered. Above the porch, a wooden sign hung by one chain. Vale Ornamental Comb Works. The final S had split down the center. Margot climbed the porch steps one at a time. The second bowed under her weight. The third gave a dry groan, but held. The brass key entered the lock only halfway. She worked it gently, pulling the door toward her to ease the pressure. Rust grated inside the mechanism. On the fourth attempt, the bolt withdrew. The door opened 3 inches and struck something on the floor. Margot lowered her shoulder and pushed. A drift of dead leaves moved across the boards. Cold air came from the rooms beyond, carrying the bitter smell of burned resin, old leather mouse droppings, and the mineral damp of stone. The odor of the craft had remained after the people were gone. The front room held a work table, 2 stools, and shelves furred with dust. Frost silvered the inside of the windows. When Margot crossed the floor, one plank complained beneath her heel, followed by another farther back, as though the building were answering in sequence. She placed her hand on the work table. The wood felt dry, ridged by knife marks, and the round scars of hot pressing plates. Beneath the dust lay a dark shine polished by forearms that had rested there for years. In the back room, rusted horn clamps lined one wall. A twinning saw hung above them, its blades orange with corrosion but still parallel. Leather aprons had stiffened on wooden pegs. Near the chimney stood a prism-shaped polishing drum mounted on an iron cradle, its outer boards caked with gray powder and hardened grease. Margot turned the drum with both hands. It resisted, then moved half a rotation with a low wooden thump. Something inside slid and settled. She leaned closer. The interior smelled faintly of cedar beneath the stone dust. By dusk, the temperature indoors had fallen below freezing. Margot blocked the broken lower window with a cupboard door and spread her coat on the floor near the chimney. She ate half a roll saved from the library, softened with water from her paper cup. The crust scraped the roof of her mouth. Darkness filled the studio without changing its shape. Wind entered through the roof and traveled along the rafters in thin, deliberate breaths. Somewhere behind the walls, a mouse worried at paper. The polishing drum gave one small knock as the wood contracted in the cold. Margot lay on her side with the lunch pail beneath her head. Through a gap in the roof, she could see a single star. She had no fire, no blanket, and no certainty. The walls would remain standing through the winter. Yet the door beside her was locked from the inside, and the key was warm in her closed hand. Some places do not ask who you were before. They ask only whether you will stay. At first light, Margot walked the property with the brass key in one pocket and a broken broom handle in the other. The well stood 30 yards behind the studio beneath a cap of warped boards. She lifted one corner and dropped a pebble through the gap. 4 seconds passed before it struck water. The hand pump had lost its leather cup, but the iron shaft still moved. Beyond the walnut trees, an outhouse leaned toward the marsh, with its door tied shut by baling twine. She spent the morning clearing a path between the 3 places, learning where snow concealed roots and where the ground gave softly beneath her boots. By the third day, she knew the floor's language. The front room creaked near the east window, the hallway clicked beneath the third joist, and one board beside the polishing drum made no sound at all. At night, she stepped around the noisy places without thinking. The studio had begun teaching her how to move inside it. She returned to town carrying the county map and the advertisement folded inside her coat. Rourke Hardware occupied a narrow brick storefront whose bell rang twice whenever the door opened. The room smelled of rope machine oil and cedar shavings. Behind the counter stood a man with a red mustache so wide it seemed to arrive before the rest of his face. "Name's Silas Rourke," he said. "What broke?" "Most of a building." He looked at her wet shoes and waited. "The Vale Comb Studio." Silas removed his spectacles. One lens was held at the hinge by copper wire. "You bought that place?" "Yes, for $9. "Yes." He put the spectacles back on. "Then you've overpaid by $8. Margot unfolded a list, written on the margin of the county map: stove brush, chimney rods, lamp oil, nails, a claw hammer, and something to seal the broken window. Silas read it without smiling. "Cash." "Not enough." He tapped one thumbnail against the counter. "You working on the building." "That answer won't satisfy a bank." "I didn't ask a bank." The bell above the door gave a small metal tremor in the wind. Silas took a ledger from beneath the register and opened to a blank page. 30-day account. "You pay what you can each Saturday. Miss 2 Saturdays, I close it." Margot nodded. "And you don't buy decorative hinges before you have a roof." "I don't want decorative hinges." "Good. They ruin people." He wrote Margot Bell at the top of the page, then placed a grease-smudged manual beside it. The cover read, "Repairs for Farm and Workshop, 1949 edition." "That's free," he said. It belonged to a man who believed every problem could be solved with oak wedges. He was wrong, but not often. Margot left with a used 16-ounce hammer for $3.25, 2 6-foot chimney rods at $1.10 each, a wire flue brush for $2.40, a quart of lamp oil for 85 cents, and a pound of cut nails for 90 cents. Silas added a square of roofing felt without entering it in the ledger. Back at the studio, she began with the chimney, because nothing else mattered until she could make heat without burning the roof. The fireplace throat was clogged with nests, mortar chips, and a black mass of creosote, hard as cooled tar. Margot spread the roofing felt across the hearth and taped its edges with strips torn from an old flour sack. She opened a slit only wide enough for the rods, then fed the wire brush upward one section at a time. The first pass brought down twigs and the skeleton of a small bird. The second released soot so fine it found the seams of her cuffs and darkened the water when she washed her hands. Higher up, the brush stopped beneath the bend in the flue. Margot twisted, clockwise, pulled back 6 inches, and drove it upward again. A plate of glazed creosote broke loose and struck the hearth with the sound of crockery. She worked for 5 hours, resting only when her shoulders began to shake. Then she climbed the roof from the lower porch using a ladder borrowed from Amos Reed. From above, she lowered a weighted chain through the chimney until it struck the brush. The impact freed another obstruction, and a column of soot fell into the sealed hearth below. By late afternoon, daylight showed through the flue. Margot cleaned the fireplace joints with a bent nail and packed the largest gaps with a temporary mixture of clay soil and ash. It was not a repair, only a promise to watch the fire. She carried in dead walnut branches no thicker than her thumb and split them with the back of the hammer. The first flame went out. The second smoked into the room. On the third attempt, she warmed the flue with a twist of burning paper, then set 3 dry sticks above it in a narrow triangle. The draft caught. Smoke drew upward in one clean stream. Margot held both hands near the flame until the skin across her knuckles began to ache. She set a dented tin cup beside the coals, added water, half an onion Amos had left on the porch, and the last heel of bread. The meal tasted faintly of soot and iron. It was hot. She ate sitting on the floor, with her back against the work table, listening to sap hiss inside the walnut wood. The next morning she turned to the back room. Dust lay thick enough to preserve the tracks of mice and the narrow slide marks left by fallen tools. Margot opened the shutters, tied a cloth over her mouth, and began at the doorway. There were 2 iron horn presses, their screw handles worn smooth by palms. A foot-powered twinning saw stood against the wall with one leather belt split, but its paired blades intact. Beneath the bench, she found 3 boxes of brass tooth gauges, each marked in pencil, with widths from 1/32 to 1/8 of an inch. A copper dye pot sat inside a larger iron bath green at the rim from old oxidation. 4 unfinished hair combs rested between sheets of newspaper dated March 1971. Their amber surfaces clouded but not cracked. A jar labeled alkanet root held only purple dust. Near the chimney hung Sister Beatrice's kind of polishing cloth, soft chamois darkened at the center by years of use. Margot touched none of the unfinished combs until the room had been swept. Last stood the polishing drum. Its body formed a long wooden prism, 6 feet from end to end, mounted horizontally on an iron axle. Leather strips lined the inside so that combs could tumble among sawdust and chalk without striking bare wood. The crank had frozen. Margot soaked the bearings with lamp oil, waited an hour, and tried again. The drum moved reluctantly. Gray powder slid inside with a dry tidal sound. She rotated it once, then stopped. The weight settled unevenly toward the left end. Margot turned the drum half a revolution and rapped each exterior panel with the hammer handle. 5 answered with the shallow note of hollow wood. The 6th, near the axle collar, gave a low, dense knock. She rapped it again. The sound did not belong to sawdust. Margot crouched and examined the panel seams. The square nails matched the others, but the leather lining visible through the inspection hatch had been stitched twice along one edge. The newer thread was still old, though less dark than the rest. She reached inside and pressed the lining. Most of it yielded against the drum wall. Near the left end, it remained firm. Margot removed the inspection hatch, loosened the axle pin, and tilted the drum until the gray polishing mixture collected at the far side. Then she slid into the opening, up to one shoulder, holding the lamp between her teeth. The leather smelled of old greased cedar and something metallic. Her fingers found a row of hidden stitches. She cut them with the tip of a small file, careful not to tear the surrounding hide. Behind the first lining lay a second sheet of leather stretched over a circular wooden disc. Cedar. The disc fitted so closely into the drum's end that no edge could be seen from outside. 2 shallow finger holes had been filled with hardened polishing paste. Margot scraped them clean. She pulled. Nothing moved. She warmed the rim with a cloth soaked in hot water, waited for the wood to swell and release, then tapped around the circumference with the hammer handle. On the 9th tap, the disc shifted outward less than a quarter inch. Cold air entered the hidden space. Margot gripped the finger holes and drew the disc free. Inside were 6 parcels wrapped in oilcloth and tied with linen cord. They had been fitted around the axle, like wedges in a wheel. Between them rested a narrow leather case and a rectangular tin box. She carried each piece to the work table. The first parcel held 2 fine-toothed saw blades greased with tallow and separated by wax paper. The second contained a set of steel gravers, their pearwood handles bearing the initials AV. The third held flattened horn plates, some pale as tea, and others stained with red-brown clouds that resembled tortoiseshell. Though curled at the corners, they were free of rot. Inside the leather case lay a hair comb no longer than Margot's hand. Its body was translucent amber horn, cut into 7 upward prongs. Along the spine ran a narrow band of real gold engraved with walnut leaves. Tiny gold pins held the metal without glue. Even beneath dust, the surface carried a soft internal glow. Margot placed it on the chamois cloth. The tin box had been sealed with wax around the lid. She set it near the fire until the wax softened, then worked a knife beneath one corner. The lid rose with a slow sigh. On top lay a folded letter. Margot did not open it. Beneath the letter were cloth rolls heavy with coins. She unwrapped them one at a time, arranging their contents in rows: $20 Liberty Head gold pieces, $10 Indian heads, silver Morgan dollars, and worn half-dollars tied in stacks with cotton thread. At the bottom rested a small envelope of banknotes preserved between sheets of oiled paper. She counted until sunset. Then she counted again. The total came to $51,400 exactly. Beside the final coin lay a bronze military medal on a faded ribbon. The reverse bore a name she could not yet read beneath the tarnish, and the year 1918. Margot sat without moving. The fire settled behind her. Outside, melting snow slipped from the eaves in slow drops. The gold comb rested on the dark cloth, deliberate and complete, while the folded letter waited on the tin lid. She wrapped the monies again, returned it to the hidden compartment, and carried only the letter and medal to the front room. But when darkness came, she could not read. Margot stepped outside and walked past the walnut trees to the edge of the marsh. Thin water moved beneath the ice, black and continuous. She watched it catch the last light until her hands went numb, listening to the patient sound of something finding its way forward beneath what appeared sealed. Some places do not ask who you were before. They ask only whether you will stay. At dawn, Margot set the medal beside the lamp and unfolded the letter on the work table. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the handwriting remained dark and upright. Each capital letter formed with the same narrow loops Sister Beatrice had used on labels in the convent cabinet. Margot recognized the hand before she reached the first full sentence. She sat down slowly, keeping both palms flat against the table. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened the drum, then the shop has outlasted me, and you have been patient enough to notice what hurried people missed. My name is Agnes Ruth Vale. Dr. Samuel Corwin of Worcester told me on February 6, 1971, that the pain beneath my ribs was pancreatic cancer and that I should put my affairs in order. He spoke gently. I thanked him, rode the afternoon bus home, and finished polishing 12 combs before dark. This work came through 4 generations. Elias Vale began shaping cattle horn in Lancaster in 1842. His daughter Miriam carried the trade to Leominster in 1876 and learned the new aniline stains without surrendering the old hand tools. Miriam's son Thomas opened this studio in 1898. Thomas taught my father Edwin, who taught Beatrice and me after school beginning in 1924. We were not permitted to touch the twin saw until we could sharpen a scraper evenly and sweep the floor without being asked. The trade closed here on March 31, 1971. For more than 30 years, the room had rarely known silence. Then the machines stopped, and I discovered how loudly an empty workshop can breathe. My husband, Walter Vale, was lost in France during the Meuse-Argonne fighting in 1918. The medal in this box was returned with his effects. He had carried one of my unfinished combs in his breast pocket. Mud had entered the teeth, but none were broken. I cleaned it and kept working because work was the only answer I knew how to give. Should you wish to try the old method, begin with horn that has rested dry for 1 full year. Heat it between iron plates at 160 degrees Fahrenheit for 12 minutes. Then press it, while warm never after it cools. For the first stain, use 2 parts alkanet infusion to 1 part oil and add litharge sparingly, no more than a teaspoon, to the cup. Let each color set overnight. When cutting teeth, pare the blades so each stroke creates 2 combs and never force the return. Polish in the drum with dry hardwood sawdust chalk and 1 spoon of rendered fat for every 8 pounds of mixture. 3 hours is usually enough. 4 may dull the edges. The money is not payment for finding this place. It is time. Use it to make careful decisions. The gold comb is the last piece I completed without regard for speed orders or factory counts. I spent 9 days engraving its leaves and lost money on it. It is the truest thing I made. An inheritance is not what one person leaves untouched for another. It is work carried far enough that a stranger may place her hands where yours once rested and continue honestly. Behind the workshop, beyond the walnut trees, Walter set a small stone marker before he left for France. Keep the grass from covering his name. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Agnes Ruth Vale, April Tate, 71. Margot read the letter twice. The second time she placed one finger beneath each line, as Sister Beatrice had taught her when reading measurements from an old pattern book. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases. The paper settled into itself as though it remembered the shape. She carried the letter through the back door. Snow had hardened overnight, and each step broke the crust with a small report. Beyond the walnut trees near the marsh grass, a low rectangle of granite showed beneath a mat of frozen leaves. Margot cleared it with her bare hands until shallow letters appeared. Walter Elias Vale, 1891 to 1988. He worked with care. There was no grave beneath it, only the marker Agnes had named. A narrow iron comb had been carved below the dates, one tooth shortened by weather. Margot returned to the studio and took the metal from the table. She cleaned it with warm water, a soft cloth, and no polish, leaving the darkness in its grooves. Then she lit the old chamois polishing rag at one corner and held it over the hearth. The leather curled slowly. Decades of chalk and grease fed a blue-edged flame. Margot used it to light the kindling, turning an object worn beyond use into the first deliberate fire of the morning. She did not mistake the letter for rescue. The roof still leaked. The well remained useless. Her account at Rourke Hardware already carried more debt than she could repay that month. Yet her first week in the studio had been held together by people who had no reason to trust her. Mrs. Hart had placed the key in her palm instead of returning it to a drawer. Silas Rourke had opened a ledger beneath her name and pretended the roofing felt cost nothing. Amos Reed had left an onion, a ladder, and a stack of split walnut beside the porch without knocking. The librarian with the green cord had brought old directories and allowed Margot to sit beside the heating pipes until closing. None of them had changed her life in one grand act. They had each made the next hour possible. Before we go farther, remember one small kindness someone once gave you when they did not know how badly you needed it. Tell us what it was if you can. A warm meal, a ride, a key, a quiet place to sit. Such things are often remembered longer than the giver ever learns. That night, Margot moved the parcels from the drum to the floor beside her coat. The tools lay wrapped near her shoulder, the metal rested inside the lunch pail, and Agnes's letter remained beneath her hand. She slept facing the workroom door, while the first careful fire kept burning behind the stones. The first snow came on December 2nd and measured 7 inches against the north wall. Margot read the roofing chapter of Silas's manual 3 times beside the stove, tracing each diagram with a soot-darkened finger. The roof measured 26 by 42 feet along its slopes. Allowing for overlap and weight, she calculated 28 bundles of cedar shingles, 4 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 32 pounds of hot-dipped nails. Silas reviewed the figures, crossed out 2 numbers, then brought a narrow roofing hatchet from beneath his counter. Its face was square, its blade curved, and the handle had been wrapped in black tape. "My brother used this before he died," he said. "Bring it back when the roof stops leaking." Amos Reed arrived the next morning in a canvas coat powdered with snow. He had roofed mills and barns for 43 years before his knees ended the work. Margot offered him money from the cash. He closed her fingers around the bills. "You'll need that after I leave." He refused payment and climbed anyway, They sistered the split north rafter with a full-length spruce timber, bolting old and new wood together at 16-inch intervals. Amos snapped a chalk line from ridge to eave and showed her how the shingles must break joint by at least 1.5 inches. Each nail went in with 3 strokes seat drive finish. On the second course, Amos touched one nailhead with his thumb. That nail's proud. Pull it now. Margot hooked it with the hatchet. Pull it. She did. They worked 11 days beneath skies that turned dark before 4. Margot carried bundles up the ladder while Amos set courses from a plank scaffold. Snow melted through her gloves and froze again at the cuffs. By the 9th day, she could hear from the hammer's pitch whether a nail had entered soundwood or a softened lath. They laid the final ridge shingles on December 15th. That evening, rain began as sleet and changed to water before midnight. Margot sat beneath the repaired roof with a basin beside her out of habit. Nothing fell into it. January exposed what firelight had concealed. The chimney bricks were spalling along the western face, their hard outer skins breaking away in thin red shells. Mortar turned to powder beneath Margot's thumb. She removed the damaged joints with a narrow chisel never deeper than twice the width of the seam and brushed each cavity clean before wetting it. Silas ordered a bag of hydraulic lime and a small sack of fireclay. For the exterior joints, Margot mixed 3 parts washed sand to 1 part lime. Around the smoke chamber, she used 2 parts fireclay, 1 part hydraulic lime, and 3 parts fine sand, adding water until the mixture held a thumbprint without slumping. The work lasted 3 weeks in temperatures that rarely rose above 28 degrees. She kept the mortar warm beside the stove and carried it outside in a covered pail. Every 15 minutes, her bare hands went numb, and she returned indoors to hold them near the hearth without touching the iron. Gloves made the joints clumsy. Bare fingers told her when the mortar had reached the back of the cavity. One morning, the wind loosened a brick above the roofline. It slid past her shoulder and broke on the frozen ground. Margot climbed down, found a matching salvaged brick behind the workshop, soaked it, and reset it before the remaining mortar stiffened. In late January, Amos stood in the yard while she lit the test fire. Margot warmed the flue with rolled newspaper, added dry maple, and watched the smoke climb. No gray ribbon leaked from the joints. Outside, the chimney drew clean against the white sky. Amos tipped his cap once. Margot fed the fire another stick. Beneath the grime, the floors were white pine fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails. Margot set every loose nail below the surface with a narrow punch, then rented a random orbit sander from Rourke Hardware for $14 a day. Silas made her sign a receipt, promising not to sand through the center of the boards. She began with 80 grit, moving with the grain, and never allowing the machine to pause while running. The first pass removed soot grease and the shallow scars left by metal bins dragged across the room. 120 grit softened the cutting marks. The final pass at 220 left the boards smooth enough to catch the weave of a cloth. Dust entered everything. It lay inside her ears, along the lamp chimney, and in the folds of Agnes's letter, until Margot moved the heirlooms into the sealed tin box. Each evening she vacuumed the joints with a borrowed shop machine and wiped the boards with mineral spirits to reveal missed scratches. She applied 3 thin coats of oil with folded cotton, kneeling from the far wall toward the door. Each coat cured 48 hours before the next. The pine changed from dull gray to dark honey, then deepened toward mahogany, where years of feet had compressed the grain. On one bad morning, Margot carried the sander to the center of the room and could not make herself plug it in. She walked to the marsh instead. A great blue heron stood in open water near the reeds, one leg hidden beneath its body. Snow moved around it in small white grains. For nearly an hour, the bird did nothing that Margot could see. She remained there until it lifted, unfolded its wings, and crossed the creek without sound. No work was done that day. The next morning, Margot finished the final pass. There were 8 windows in the studio. 3 had no glass at all. 4 held panes cracked from corner to corner. The 8th contained a single original sheet dated by a glazier's mark to 1788, its surface wavering with small trapped bubbles. Margot preserved it exactly where it stood. She removed the broken panes with a putty knife heated near the stove, lifting the old glazing in short sections so the wooden rabbets would not split. Each frame was scraped primed with boiled linseed oil and left overnight before new glass was bedded. Margot rolled DAPA 33 glazing putty between her palms until it softened, pressed a thin bed into each rabbet, and set the glass with even thumb pressure. Glazier's points went in every 8 inches. The final putty bevel ran from the sight line of the sash to the outer edge smooth enough to shed water without exposing the points. The sash cords had rotted to black fiber. She replaced them with 1/4-inch braided cotton, feeding each line over the pulley and tying a figure-8 knot through the counterweight eye. The first weight vanished inside the wall before she secured it. Margot removed the pocket cover, recovered the iron block with bent wire, and began again. By the last window, her cuts were square, and her putty lines no longer required correction. She raised the sash and let it balance halfway. Outside, a chickadee landed on a walnut branch, close enough for Margot to see the black seam beneath its white cheek. It tilted forward, watching her through the new glass. Margot rested one hand on the sill. The bird remained until the putty knife touched the wood, then lifted into the February light. 2 winters later, on December 14, 2024. Margot completed the first comb made in the studio since Agnes Vale closed the trade. She had begun with a single plate of cattle horn, rested dry for 13 months in the rafters. She warmed it between iron plates, pressed it flat, and stained it in 3 patient stages until amber russet and near black moved through the surface like light beneath shallow water. The paired blades of the twinning saw entered evenly. Not one tooth tore on the return stroke. For the polishing drum, Margot used 8 pounds of maple sawdust chalk sifted through linen and 1 spoonful of rendered fat. She turned the crank by hand for 3 hours, stopping every 30 minutes to check the edges. The finished comb was small with 9 teeth and a spine engraved with 1 walnut leaf. Margot set it on Agnes's chamois cloth and did not touch it again until morning. The studio around it had become whole without becoming new. White pine floors carried their old nailheads beneath 3 coats of oil. Restored windows held winter light in wavering panes. The workbench retained every cut and scorch mark that did not weaken it. Above the fireplace hung Walter's medal, the gold hair comb, and Sister Beatrice's remembered sentence written on a plain card in Margot's careful hand. Nothing had been polished beyond recognition. The brass key from beneath the cellar step remained on the mantel through both winters. Margot tried it in every cupboard, chest drawer, and lock plate she could find. It fitted none. Its purpose appeared after a lightning storm split a dead limb from the larger walnut tree, while sawing the fallen wood into stove lengths. Margot noticed a green edge beneath a fold of bark near the base of the trunk. She cleared moss and soil with a wooden scraper and uncovered an oval brass plate set directly into the living tree. At its center waited a keyhole shaped by hand rather than machine. The little key turned once. A narrow compartment opened behind the plate. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, lay a folded 48-star American flag and a note dated October 3, 1918, written by Miriam Vale, while influenza and war notices moved through Leominster. My son Thomas, if this reaches you after the army has carried Walter overseas, keep the flag until every person named in this family has returned or been properly remembered. Do not place it above the shop while men are dying. A flag should not be used to decorate grief. The walnut will keep it dry. The women will remember where. Miriam Vale. Walter had not returned. Thomas had preserved the flag. Agnes had preserved the medal. Sister Beatrice had preserved the work by placing it in the hands of a girl who never knew she was being prepared to receive it. Margot carried the flag indoors and folded it again along the same softened lines. On November 11, 2025, she took Walter's medal to the Massachusetts Veterans Memorial Cemetery in Winchendon. No crowd accompanied her. Amos drove because the morning roads were icy, and Mrs. Hart brought a small bundle of winterberry tied with cotton thread. At 11 o'clock, Margot placed the medal beneath Walter's name in the cemetery register display for the day. She stood through 2 minutes of silence, then carried it home before dusk, as Agnes had carried his unfinished comb. The hidden money remained mostly untouched. Margot spent $1 silver on horn plates from an old button-maker's estate, another on a box of fine saw blades, and 3 worn $half on a proper leather apron, stitched by a harness repairman in Lancaster. She recorded every coin in Agnes's ledger. The rest returned to the compartment behind the polishing drum. Margot wrapped the rolls in fresh oilcloth and added a note to the outside. For the next one, she did not call it savings, she called it time. The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris allowed Margot to pin a white index card to the corkboard beside the cafe register. Hand-cut horn combs. Repairs accepted. Vale Ornamental Comb Works, Saturdays, 9 to 2. The first customer brought a cracked morning comb wrapped in a handkerchief. The second wanted 2 missing teeth replaced in a barrette that had belonged to her mother. Within 4 months, more than 40 names had gathered on a mailing list kept in a school notebook. Margot completed few orders. Some repairs required a week, some took a month. When a customer asked why the work could not move faster, she showed them where old horn became translucent at the edge and explained what haste would break. Most people understood. Those who did not could purchase plastic elsewhere. Caleb returned one April afternoon taller than Margot remembered, and carrying a board beneath his arm. He had carved the original studio name in deep block letters following the shape of the faded sign above the porch. Vale Ornamental Comb Works. Below it on a separate strip of walnut he had added 2 words. And daughters. Margot ran her thumb over the final S. There were no daughters after Agnes, she said. Caleb set the sign against the workbench. There are now. She looked at him. My mother said it doesn't have to mean blood. They hung the sign before sunset. Amos held the ladder while Caleb drove the screws. Doris watched from the road, with a paper bag of biscuits beneath one arm. Reverend Boyd stood near the walnut trees and offered the same prayer he had given each morning during the rebuilding. Keep these hands steady. The new sign moved slightly in the spring wind, but did not strike the wall. That evening, Margot opened the tin box and placed a clean sheet of paper beside Agnes's letter. She sharpened the fountain pen Mrs. Hart had given her and began with the words already waiting in the room. My dear one, whoever you are. She wrote that the roof had been repaired, that the well water tested clean, and that the old glass remained in the eastern window. She described how to warm horn without scorching it, and where to stand when the drum's axle needed oil. She warned that one floorboard near the chimney still clicked in damp weather. She did not explain every hardship. A letter intended for a stranger should leave them room to arrive as themselves. Margot wrote until the fire settled low. Then she folded the page once placed it beneath Agnes's letter and returned both to the tin box. She did not seal the compartment. The next person should not need a hammer to reach what had been kept for them. Outside, walnut catkins turned in the evening wind. The creek moved loudly beyond the reeds, carrying winter water eastward. Inside, the completed comb waited on the bench beside a small block of uncut horn. Some places do not ask who you were before. They ask only whether you will stay. Margot closed the workshop door, but she did not turn the key. Tomorrow was Saturday, and someone from the mailing list would arrive with an object broken carefully enough to save. The tortoiseshell comb studio waits. It has always waited. Years afterward, the original $9 bill remained in the bottom drawer of Mrs. Hart's desk at the county annex. She had exchanged it from the register on the day Margot signed the deed and written the parcel number along one white margin. Whenever a new clerk asked why she kept it, Mrs. Hart answered without looking up from her work. Proof that value and price have never been the same thing.
The Heroic Veteran Dogs is a fictional channel created to entertain, educate, and inspire the audience by exploring the deep, loyal bond between veterans and their dogs. All channel content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is entirely coincidental.